Lucas never imagined that a simple trip to the neighborhood grocery store would change his life forever. At 14, he was an ordinary boy, intelligent, curious, and always dreaming. But that afternoon, as he was returning home, he was approached by two police officers who looked at him as if they already knew something. "You match the description," they said, without giving any explanation. Before he could understand, he was already handcuffed and being taken to the police station, without the right to say a single word. In the district, he discovered the accusation against him, robbery and assault on an influential man in the city. Lucas had no reaction. He was never there. He didn't know the victim, and he had nothing to do with the crime. But his words seemed to have no weight in the face of the accusation from someone with power. His desperate mother tried to argue, looking for witnesses who could prove his innocence. But the system seemed to have already decided the boy's fate even before a trial. Now, before the court, Lucas finds himself alone against a world that doesn't give him a chance. The judge, with a cold look, observes the boy as if it were just another unimportant case. The prosecutor smiles dismissively, sure that this will be a quick process. But what no one expected was that this boy, just 14 years old, would face the court in a way that would leave even the judge speechless. What did he say? How did a boy manage to turn the tables on a system that seemed to have already condemned him? This story is not just about a trial, but about courage, intelligence, and a moment that would change everything. And what happened next will surprise you. If this story has captivated you so far, imagine what comes next. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell, because this case will surprise you in every detail. Now, let's continue. Lucas felt the weight of everyone's gaze around him. Sitting in the dock, he pressed his fingers against his thighs, trying to control his anxiety. The courtroom seemed huge, but at the same time suffocating. The murmur of the people in the audience created a constant buzz, as if each whisper carried an advanced judgment upon it. He shouldn't be there. He wasn't guilty. But no one seemed interested in hearing this. His mother, Dona Elsie, was sitting in the front row, her eyes swollen from crying. Beside him, a public defender was leafing through some pages, visibly disinterested. Lucas looked at him and realized that the man didn't even know his name properly. For that lawyer, Lucas was just another case in a pile of cases. The judge banged the gavel, calling for silence in the room. The prosecutor, a tall man in an expensive suit and a bored expression, stood up and walked slowly across the courtroom, looking at the audience before resting his eyes on Lucas. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are faced with a clear case. The defendant was identified by the victim as the person responsible for the crime. There is no doubt about his participation, and we want justice for those who suffered from this violent act." Lucas frowned. He wanted to scream, say that it was a lie, but he only had to see the faces around him to understand that no one there expected to hear him. For them, a poor black boy without a good lawyer was already guilty by definition. The judge turned to the defense and asked, without hiding his impatient tone, "Does the defense want to present anything before we hear the witnesses?" Lucas's lawyer cleared his throat and stood up without much haste. "Well, my client pleads his innocence, but we recognize that there is testimony against him, so we would just like to clarify a few points." Lucas looked at his mother. She held her hands together, as if she were praying. His heart sped up. It was not possible that that would be the only defense he would have. He needed to react. He couldn't let his life be decided without a fight. He stood up suddenly, and the room fell silent. "Your Excellency, may I speak?" His voice sounded firm, even with fear growing inside him. The judge raised an eyebrow in surprise. The prosecutor let out a muffled laugh, as if it were a joke. "You have a lawyer to speak for you, boy." Lucas swallowed hard, but maintained his posture. "With all due respect, Your Honor, if I just let him speak, my story won't be told." The judge watched him for a few seconds before waving his hand. "Very good. Speak, but be brief." Lucas took a deep breath and looked at the audience, then at the prosecutor, and finally at the judge. "I wasn't there. I don't even know this person who accused me, and I can prove it. But first, I want to ask something. If I were a white kid with no criminal record, with a lawyer father, would I be here today?" A heavy silence took over the court. The prosecutor was disconcerted. The judge adjusted his posture in his chair. "I just want a fair trial. I want them to look at the evidence, not the color of my skin. I want you to hear the facts, not just testimony without evidence. If I'm here, then I need to be given the right to truly defend myself." Lucas's mother started to cry, but this time it was different. It wasn't just despair, it was pride. The entire court seemed to have held its breath. The judge cleared his throat and looked at the prosecutor. "The young man is right. We need to ensure a fair trial. Present your evidence, Mr. Prosecutor." Lucas felt a small relief, but he knew that the battle was still far from over. He had gained a space to be heard. Now he needed to prove his innocence before it was too late. Lucas knew that no one would fight for him if he didn't do it himself. The image of the disinterested lawyer at his side only reinforced this certainty. He looked at his mother, Dona Elsie, and remembered all the times she taught him to question, to think, to never accept something without first understanding it. Since he was little, she made him read aloud books that talked about great figures in history, about civil rights, about struggles for justice. Knowledge is the only weapon that no one can take from you, my son, she always said. Now, there in court, Lucas realized it was time to use that weapon. He didn't have a degree. He didn't know all the laws, but he knew how to reason. He knew how to argue. And most of all, he knew the truth was on his side. He took a deep breath and turned to the judge. Your Honor, I would like to question the evidence against me. The judge raised an eyebrow. The prosecutor chuckled. This isn't a school debate, kid. You don't have the experience to conduct a defense. Lucas kept his gaze steady. Not having experience doesn't mean I don't have the right to my voice. If the only thing there is against me is a testimony, then I want that witness questioned. The judge watched the boy for a few seconds before leaning back in his chair. Very good. Let's hear the witness. The prosecutor, visibly uncomfortable with the change of direction, called the man who accused Lucas. He was a well-known businessman in the city, a well-dressed guy with grey hair and an arrogant look. He took the witness stand and looked at Lucas as if he had already won. Can you describe exactly what happened? Asked the prosecutor. The man cleared his throat and began his story. He said he was leaving the office at night when he was attacked by a young black man wearing a blue t-shirt and jeans who tried to steal his wallet. He said there was a struggle, and he could clearly see the attacker's face before he fled. Lucas listened carefully to every word. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up and approached the witness stand. Are you absolutely sure that it was me who attacked you? The man shook his head affirmatively. Absolute. I never forget a face. Lucas crossed his arms and took a deep breath. You mentioned that the attack happened at night. Can you tell me what the street lighting was like where this occurred? The man hesitated for a moment. There was a street light, but it was a little dark. So you were in a dark place, and in the middle of a fight, you were able to clearly see the attacker's face? The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Yes, I saw it. Lucas nodded. You mentioned that the attacker was wearing a blue t-shirt and jeans. Do you know what clothes I was wearing when I was arrested? The man frowned, not understanding what Lucas was getting at. The judge turned to the arresting officer and asked him to respond. The boy was wearing a red shirt and black shorts. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Lucas turned to the judge. So, Your Honor, how can this gentleman say with such certainty that I am the culprit, if not even the clothes match the description? The prosecutor cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Witnesses can get things wrong on minor details. Lucas didn't let him finish. Minor details? The attacker's clothing is not a minor detail. And there's more. I have an alibi. At the time of the crime, I was at home studying with my mother. The judge turned to Dona Elsie, who nodded, excited. My son was with me. He spent the entire night preparing for a school test. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The judge looked at the prosecutor. Do you have any other evidence besides the testimony? The prosecutor leafed through some papers, visibly disconcerted. No, Your Excellency. Lucas swallowed hard. He knew he had won. The judge took a deep breath and banged the gavel. Given the inconsistency in the testimony and the absence of concrete evidence, the defendant is free from the charges. Case closed. Dona Elsie let out a sob of relief and ran to hug her son. The court remained silent for a few seconds before some people began to applaud. The 14-year-old boy, who no one took seriously, had defeated a system that already considered him guilty before even hearing his story. As he left the courtroom, a reporter approached. Lucas, how did you manage to defend yourself so well? He smirked and looked at his mother. I only did what my mother always taught me. I used knowledge as my best weapon. The big day had arrived. The courtroom was packed, and Lucas felt the weight of every gaze that turned his way, some curious, others full of judgment. There were whispers everywhere, whispered comments that he couldn't quite make out, but he knew what they meant. Another troubled young man. This one is gone. Poor guy. He doesn't have a chance. Dona Elsie was sitting in the first row, with her hands shaking in her lap. Her face carried the concern of a mother who already knew the fate of many young people like her son. But Lucas would not let himself be discouraged. He took a deep breath and fixed his eyes on the judge, an old man with a rigid posture, who was leafing through some documents before raising his head and looking at him with a cold and distant look. Lucas dos Santos, 14 years old, said the judge, adjusting his glasses on his face. Accused of robbery and assault. How do you declare? Lucas glanced quickly at his lawyer, who seemed as uninterested as ever. He then straightened his shoulders and spoke firmly. Not guilty. Your Honor. The judge let out an impatient sigh. Everyone says that, kid. The comment made some people laugh softly. Lucas felt his blood boil, but he remained calm. The prosecutor stood up. He was a tall, well-dressed and self-assured man, someone used to winning cases like this without much effort. He slowly walked to the middle of the room, making a point of looking at the jurors before addressing the judge. Your Excellency, this is a simple case. We have testimony from a respectable man in town who identified this boy as the attacker. There is no reason for us to prolong this trial. The judge nodded slightly. The prosecution can present the witness. The businessman accusing Lucas took the witness stand, straightened his tie and cleared his throat before starting to speak. I saw this boy. He was the one who tried to rob me. I have no doubts. Lucas stared at him without blinking. When the judge gave him the floor to question the witness, he calmly stood up. Are you sure it was me? The businessman frowned. Yes, absolutely. You said it was dark. How could you see my face so clearly? There was enough light. But you mentioned before that the street wasn't well lit. Can you see well in the dark? The man opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. The prosecutor hastened to intervene. Witnesses may miss small details, but facial recognition was carried out shortly after the crime. Lucas turned to him. And if the recognition was made right after the crime, why did the police arrest me hours later, while I was at home studying? A heavy silence fell over the room. The judge looked at the prosecutor, who clearly did not have an immediate answer. Do you have an answer for that? Asked the judge. The prosecutor coughed, trying to buy time. The police followed the victim's descriptions. Lucas crossed his arms. And you completely ignored the fact that I was somewhere else at the time of the crime? The judge looked at Lucas with a closer look now. For the first time, she seemed to see him not as a closed case, but as a boy who might be right. Go on, boy, said the judge. Lucas returned to address the businessman. You mentioned that my attacker was wearing a blue t-shirt and jeans. Do you know what I was wearing when I was arrested? The businessman blinked a few times, confused. The judge turned to the arresting officer. Reply. The officer flipped through his notes and responded hesitantly. Red t-shirt and black shorts, Your Honor. Another murmur filled the court. Lucas took a deep breath and looked at the jurors. The only thing against me is a testimony full of contradictions. No concrete proof, no recording, no physical evidence. I am just a 14-year-old boy being judged not for what I did, but for who they think I am. The judge rubbed his chin and looked at the prosecutor. Is there any other evidence against the defendant? The prosecutor quickly leafed through the papers, but found nothing. No, Your Excellency. The judge leaned forward and banged the gavel. In view of the absence of evidence and the inconsistency of the testimony, the defendant is free from the charges. Case closed. The court was silent for a moment before some applause began to ring out. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, feeling relief wash over his chest. He had won, not because of luck, but because he knew how to defend himself with the only weapon his mother always taught him to use: knowledge. The silence inside the courtroom was so thick that Lucas could almost hear it. The judge watched him with a mixture of impatience and curiosity, while the prosecutor tried to hide his discomfort. The witness, the businessman who accused him, was adjusting his tie with sweaty hands. Lucas knew that this was the decisive moment. If there was any chance of escaping that unfair fate, it was now. He took a deep breath and looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, if you allow me, I would like to ask some questions to Mr. Carlos, the witness who claims to have seen me commit the crime. The judge narrowed his eyes for a moment, but nodded. Very good. Go ahead. Lucas walked slowly until he was face to face with the man who accused him. His eyes met his, and the businessman quickly looked away, as if he already knew something was about to go wrong. Mr. Carlos, you said, with absolute certainty, that it was me who tried to rob you. The man cleared his throat before responding. Yes, it was you. And you also stated that everything happened at night, on a dimly lit street. Yes, but there was enough light to see his face. Lucas crossed his arms and tilted his head slightly to the side. You wear glasses, correct? The question caught the man off guard. Yes, I use it. And at the time of the alleged assault, were you wearing your glasses? The businessman frowned, trying to remember. I don't think so. Lucas took a step forward. Do you have any vision problems when you are without glasses? I have mild myopia, nothing that prevents me from seeing. Lucas turned to the judge. Your Honor, according to experts, myopic people have difficulty seeing details at long distances, especially at night. Mr. Carlos, without his glasses, was in a dark environment and in a stressful situation. Still, he claims he recognized me with absolute certainty. Do you think this is reasonable? The judge rubbed his chin and looked at the witness. The young man has a point. The prosecutor hurried to get up. This does not invalidate the testimony, Your Excellency. Small errors are common, but he kept the general description of the defendant. Lucas turned to the prosecutor. Let's talk about that description. Mr.
Mr. Carlos said that the attacker was wearing a blue t-shirt and jeans.
Correct.
The judge looked at the witness, who nodded. Lucas turned to the officer who made his arrest. Police officer, what was I wearing when I was detained?
The officer quickly flipped through his report.
Red t-shirt and black shorts. Lucas pointed to the witness.
So how can he be sure it was me, if not even my clothes match the description?
The judge now no longer hid his discomfort. The prosecutor, who had previously been full of confidence, shuffled the papers as if desperately searching for an answer. Lucas then took a step back and looked at everyone in the courtroom. So far, the only evidence against me is this man's testimony. But we have already proven that he may have been confused.
There are no videos. There are no fingerprints. There is no hard evidence. The only thing against me is his word. Lucas turned to the judge again. And one more thing. Your Excellency.
If it were really me, why would I have gone home calmly after the crime?
A criminal runs away, disappears, tries to hide.
I was at home, studying with my mother, as I do every night. This doesn't make sense. The judge rested his elbows on the table and took a deep breath before turning to the prosecutor.
Given the inconsistencies presented by the defendant, is there any concrete evidence to support the accusation?
The prosecutor quickly leafed through the papers, looking for something that could save him from that situation, but there was nothing.
No. Your Excellency.
The judge was silent for a few seconds.
Then he took his hammer and hit the table.
The defendant is free of all charges.
Case closed.
The court was silent for a moment before some people began to murmur. Donor LCI put her hands to her face and burst into tears. Lucas, still trying to process everything, felt a lump in his throat. He had won.
As he left the courtroom, a reporter ran up to him with a microphone.
Lucas, how did you manage to defend yourself so well? He looked at his mother, who was still crying with emotion, and then turned to the reporter.
My mother always told me that truth and knowledge are the greatest weapons anyone can have.
Today, I proved her right.
The court was plunged into absolute silence. The impact of Lucas' words hung over everyone like a cloud filled with tension.
He remained standing in the center of the room, without looking away. The prosecutor, previously sure of his victory, now leafed through the documents on the table, trying to find some loophole that could reverse the situation. The judge watched everything attentively, his fingers drumming on the wood of the bench. His closed expression showed that he was absorbing every detail. Lucas took a deep breath.
His heart was pounding, but he knew he couldn't back down.
Your Honor, before I continue, allow me to ask everyone in this room something, he said, turning to the audience and the jurors. What do you see when you look at me? People looked at each other, not knowing what to say. The judge frowned.
Explain yourself, young man. Lucas walked slowly, looking at each person present. Do you see a criminal? Someone who is born condemned? Do you see a dangerous boy? Or just a black kid who, because he's black, is already considered guilty before he's even heard?
Some people looked away.
Others seemed restless.
This court should be a place where the truth matters, where justice is blind to skin color, social class, or origin. But is that what's happening here? The prosecutor cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure.
The court does not judge color, but evidence, boy.
Lucas turned to him quickly.
Then show me the evidence.
The prosecutor hesitated.
We have the victim's testimony, a testimony full of flaws. Lucas interrupted.
Mr. Carlos said he saw me clearly in the dark, without his glasses.
He said I was wearing clothes that didn't even match my appearance at the time of arrest.
And still, I was arrested. The judge adjusted his glasses and leaned forward.
Continue.
Lucas took a deep breath.
If the only evidence against me is contradictory testimony, then what is happening here is not justice. It is a judgment based on assumptions.
Based on fear.
Based on a system that already found me guilty before I even spoke.
The silence in the room became even heavier. The prosecutor pursed his lips, speechless. Your Honor, Lucas turned to the judge, his voice firm. If I had been a white kid from a rich family, would this trial have even happened? The judge remained motionless for a few seconds. His gaze, previously indifferent, now showed deep reflection.
He turned to the prosecutor.
Is there anything else the prosecution wants to add? The prosecutor ran his hand over his forehead in frustration.
No. Your Excellency.
The judge took a deep breath, picked up the gavel, and knocked on the table.
Given the lack of concrete evidence and the inconsistency of testimony, this court cannot convict a young man based on assumptions.
The defendant is free of all charges.
Case closed.
The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Donor LCI, with tears streaming down her face, quickly got up and ran to hug Lucas. The young man closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that struggle dissolve into relief.
As he left the court, a journalist ran up to him.
Lucas, what do you have to say after all this? He looked at the camera, his expression serious.
I proved my innocence, but how many cannot do the same?
How many are judged without being heard? Today I was strong, but what about those who don't have the chance? Justice needs to change. Until this happens, Many will continue to be condemned before they even have the chance to speak. The camera recorded his words, and at that moment, Lucas realized that his fight went beyond that courtroom. The entire courtroom was plunged into absolute silence. Lucas's voice still hung in the air, like an echo that no one dared to interrupt. The judge, an experienced man accustomed to controlling the court with a firm grip, leaned forward slightly, adjusting his glasses with a slow movement. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. Lucas was still standing in the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the judge, waiting for an answer. But there was no answer. The young man had just dismantled, piece by piece, all the accusations made.
The once confident prosecutor now shuffled through the papers in front of him, but found nothing that could save his argument.
He cleared his throat, but couldn't form a coherent sentence. The judge, still thoughtful, looked at Lucas with a different expression.
Before, I only saw a defendant there, a routine case. Now he saw a young man who, against all odds, had defended himself with unbeatable logic.
"You're only 14 years old," said the judge, breaking the silence.
Lucas nodded.
"Yes, Your Honor."
But age does not define intelligence.
"Not justice."
The judge placed his hands on the table and let out a long sigh.
"For years, I sat in this chair, listening to hundreds of cases. I have seen renowned lawyers, shrewd prosecutors, and skilled defenders.
But I have never seen a 14-year-old boy dismantle an entire accusation with the force of logic alone."
The prosecutor crossed his arms and tried to regain his position. "Your Excellency, with all due respect, we cannot forget that a crime was committed." Lucas turned to him immediately. "And I'm to blame just because someone said it was me."
No proof?
"Without anything concrete."
If that is the criteria, anyone can be wrongly accused at any time.
The judge took a deep breath. He looked at the prosecutor. "And then, is there any real evidence against the defendant?" The prosecutor flipped through his documents once again.
Sweat dripped down his forehead.
He wanted to find something, anything, but there was nothing.
No, Your Excellency.
No concrete proof.
The judge drummed his fingers on the table and then turned to Lucas.
"Did you know you had the right to remain silent?" Lucas smiled sideways. "Yes, Your Honor. But silence has never helped anyone fight injustice." The judge closed his eyes for a moment and then opened them again, turning to everyone in the courtroom. "Justice is based on facts, not prejudices, not assumptions. We cannot condemn a young man just because he fits the profile we expected to find. The defendant is free of all charges."
Case closed.
The wood of the hammer met the table hard. The sound echoed through the courtroom, sealing the final decision. Donna LCIA, who until then had been holding back her emotions, finally let the tears flow and ran to hug her son. Lucas felt his mother's strong grip. Relief and pride mixed in that hug.
When leaving the court, a crowd was already waiting outside. Reporters, onlookers, activists.
A journalist approached with a microphone.
"Lucas, you just faced an entire court and defended yourself.
How do you feel?" Lucas looked at the sky for a moment, took a deep breath, and then replied, relieved.
But this isn't just about me. Today was my victory."
"But what about those who don't have the chance to speak?" The reporter hesitated. "What do you mean?" Lucas faced the camera.
"I want to say that there are many people being convicted without evidence, without being heard, without having the opportunity that I had.
What happened today needs to happen for many others. Justice is only justice when it applies to everyone." And then he turned, holding his mother's hand, and walked away, knowing that this was not the end of his story.
It was just the beginning. For you said, let's create this story, using only running text without topics in the construction of my script, using 7,000 characters, adding speeches during the story, the verdict without concrete evidence against Lucas. The court is obliged to declare him innocent.
The crowd reacts with surprise and admiration.
Czech said. The silence that dominated the court was almost suffocating.
The judge kept his eyes fixed on Lucas, as if he was still trying to find some loophole, some justification for not giving that verdict. But there wasn't.
There was nothing left against the boy.
Each prosecution argument had been dismantled with surgical precision. The prosecutor no longer leafed through papers, no longer tried to rebut.
He just stared at the table in front of him, defeated.
The witness, who had once spoken with such certainty, now avoided all eye contact. Lucas remained standing, his chest rising and falling slowly, controlling his breathing. But his gaze remained steady. He didn't deviate for even a second. He knew he was winning, but he still needed to hear the words that would seal his fate. The judge cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, looking for the posture he always used to announce important decisions.
His fingers drummed on the wood before he finally spoke. "This court has analyzed the evidence presented,"
he began, pausing for a moment as if to weigh each word, and concluded that there is no concrete evidence linking the defendant to the crime of which he was accused. A murmur ran through the room. Some people looked at Lucas in amazement. Others just waited for the conclusion.
Therefore,
the judge took a deep breath. This court declares Lucas innocent of all charges.
The case is closed.
The sound of the hammer hitting the wood echoed throughout the room, and for a moment, silence remained. as if no one could believe what had just happened.
But then, a buzz took over the space, growing like a wave.
Some people stood up, surprise evident on their faces. Others murmured amongst themselves, still processing the turn of events. Donna LCIA let out a sob before running to hug her son. "My boy."
I knew the truth would win, she cried, holding Lucas' face with her shaking hands. Lucas hugged her back, feeling the weight of it all finally dissolve.
The prosecutor collected his papers in silence, without even looking at the judge or the audience. He just hung his head and left, defeated not just by the boy, but by the truth.
Outside, a crowd was already gathering.
Journalists waited anxiously, cameras and microphones ready to capture every word.
As Lucas and his mother walked out the courtroom doors, the sound of flashes and voices blended into a whirlwind. "Lucas, you just faced a trial that seemed last. How do you feel now?"
asked a reporter, pushing the microphone towards him.
Lucas took a deep breath and looked directly at the camera. "Relieved," he said.
"But this isn't just about me. Today, I managed to prove my innocence. But how many others don't have the chance?"
"How many are condemned without being heard?"
The reporter hesitated.
"Do you think you were a victim of prejudice?" Lucas pursed his lips before responding. "I think I was arrested first and tried later. And this happens every day to many people. Today, I had a voice."
"But what about those who don't?" The crowd murmured, some nodding their heads in agreement.
A lady in the audience wiped away a tear. "And now, Lucas,
"What do you intend to do?" He looked at his mother, who was still holding his hand, and then turned to the reporter.
"Continue studying, because knowledge was my defense today, and tomorrow it could be the defense of many others." And with that, he turned and walked out of there. But he knew that this was not the last time he would face a court of law, whether in a court of law or in his own life.
But now he was ready.
After the verdict, Lucas and his mother left the courtroom, but the world outside was already different.
The small town that had previously regarded them with suspicion was now filled with cameras and journalists. What seemed to be just another case of local injustice turned into a symbol of resistance.
The 14-year-old who stood up to an entire system, challenging prejudices and inequality, was now recognized across the country.
In the following weeks, Lucas became the subject of all the news, radio programs, and debates. The news of his unexpected victory spread like wildfire, and soon his name was synonymous with courage and intelligence.
But while the media hipped him up, he stayed in his corner, trying to digest what had just happened. One afternoon, while he was at home, his mother entered the room, holding a letter. She looked at Lucas hesitantly. "Lucas, you need to see this," she said, her voice shaking. He took the letter and opened it. It was an invitation to a live interview on one of the biggest TV shows in the country. "They want to hear you, son," she added, trying to hold back the tears.
Lucas read the letter in silence. I didn't know what to feel.
The idea of being recognized by millions of people seemed strange to him, but at the same time, he knew his fight wasn't just about him.
It was about everyone who didn't have the chance to speak, to defend themselves, to be heard. The next day, upon entering the recording studio, Lucas was greeted with applause and a crowd of journalists and cameras pointed at him. He felt a lump in his throat, but he couldn't back away. He sat in the chair in front of the presenters, the light from the cameras illuminating his face, and the microphone positioned in front of his lips. "Lucas, you became a symbol for thousands of people in the country." "What do you feel about this?" asked the presenter, a middle-aged man with an approving smile.
Lucas took a deep breath, looking at the audience who watched him with expectant eyes. I don't really know what to say," he began, his voice firm but full of emotion. "What happened to me is not unique.
I'm an example. Yes, but it's sad that I'm an example of something that should be normal. Being heard, being respected, being treated fairly.
If my story can help open people's eyes, then that's what matters."
The audience was silent, and the camera focused on his serious face.
"Do you believe that your victory was a reflection of a flawed system?" continued the presenter, now more serious.
Lucas nodded, his gaze steady.
"Yes, justice needs to change.
The system is designed to protect some and leave others at the mercy of guesswork.
If a young black man, without the opportunity of a good lawyer, can prove his innocence with just logic and intelligence, then this shows that the system is not working properly.
It should be fair to everyone, but it isn't."
The presenter, visibly impressed, paused before continuing.
"And what do you intend to do now?" Lucas looked at his mother, who was sitting in the back, watching everything with pride.
He felt he now had a much greater responsibility. "I want to continue studying, continue learning, because I know that knowledge gave me the opportunity to defend my truth."
"But what I want most is for other young people those who don't have the same chances, to have an opportunity to fight too. We cannot allow more lives to be destroyed due to a lack of opportunities. The camera captured every word, every look. When Lucas finished speaking, the entire studio was silent. It was the kind of silence that only comes when something profound is said, something that touches the soul. The repercussion was immediate. It wasn't just an interview, it was a movement. During the following weeks, groups of activists began to organize. Protests and debates about racism and inequality spread across the country. Lucas' words were seen as a cry of resistance, a call for everyone to stop and look at the system that surrounded them. The young man had become the face of a struggle that, although behind many closed doors, was now in plain sight.
What happened next was even more impressive. Human rights organizations contacted Lucas and his family, offering support for the young man to become a speaker, someone capable of taking his message to greater, more distant places. Lucas didn't see himself as a leader, but he understood that his experience now had a greater purpose. He no longer fought for himself.
He was fighting for real change. With each lecture, each interview, he managed to touch more hearts.
And with that, the consciousness of a nation changed little by little.
Over the months, Lucas' case began to be taught in schools, used as an example in debates about justice and equity. Young people from different parts of Brazil began to be inspired by him, to believe that his voice could also be heard.
The impact of a 14-year-old boy's courage spread, leaving a mark that would not be easily erased.
Meanwhile, Lucas continued with his life, now more focused than ever. He knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew he had helped set something bigger than himself in motion, and that, for him, was just the beginning.
After the great repercussion of his case, Lucas became a public figure, but his life, in essence, remained the same. He still woke up early, studied hard, and helped his mother with the housework. But now, there was something different inside him, a flame of determination that never existed before, fueled by the experience he lived in court and the impact he made on the country.
Lucas knew that his life would never be the same, and he was determined to take advantage of the opportunities that would arise in front of him to change the world in his own way. At school, his classmates began to see him with different eyes. Before, Lucas was just a good student, quiet, with quick and logical thinking. But now, he was a symbol of courage, intelligence, and resistance. He began to be sought after by teachers and even young people who saw him as a source of inspiration. The looks and words of support he received were many. But more than that, there was a silent and deep look in his eyes, as if he was already planning the next step.
One morning, after a live interview about his court victory, Lucas was at home thinking.
His mother, who had always supported him unconditionally, entered the room with a curious look. "What are you thinking, son?" she asked, watching him closely. Lucas leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the table as his mind raced. "MOM, I want to be a lawyer."
She looked at him in surprise, an expression mixed with pride and apprehension.
"Attorney? But you're only 14. How are you going to do this?"
He smiled, looking into her eyes with the same certainty he had when he dismantled the accusation in court. "I know I'm young, but what I learned is that the law can be the key to fighting for justice.
I want to defend people like me, people who sometimes don't have a voice.
I want to help other innocent people not to go through what I went through."
His mother came over and hugged him tightly, almost as if she felt the weight of the responsibility he was taking on, but also the courage he was showing.
"You have the heart of a warrior, my son,
and the mind of a leader.
If this is what you want, I will be by your side, always." Lucas's decision was made. He knew the path would not be easy.
Law school would require a lot of effort, and he did not have the money to cover the costs of a higher education.
But that didn't discourage him.
The boy who had faced an entire system without fear now felt an even greater desire to change the reality that surrounded him. In the following months, Lucas dedicated himself to his studies like never before, not just to school, but also to books and online courses on law, social justice, and citizenship. He looked for volunteers to guide him and to better understand how the country's legal system worked.
He sought inspiration from great names in history, such as Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., and other activists who, like him, used their voices to fight oppression. But he also knew he would need a good plan.
Lucas looked for scholarship programs and wrote letters to various institutions seeking help.
He knew that without the help of others, it would be impossible to go it alone. When he finally received a positive response from a reputed university, he felt as if the world had opened up before him.
It was the first step on a journey that would be long and full of obstacles, but he was determined.
His mother's support was fundamental.
Donor LCIA, who always believed in her son's potential, financial, did not hesitate to sell some assets she owned to help finance the first part of his studies.
She knew that this was the sacrifice necessary for Lucas to achieve his dreams,
And even in times of trouble, she was willing to do whatever she could to support his cause. In his first week at university, Lucas felt a mixture of excitement and insecurity.
he was no longer the boy who faced a court, but a student among hundreds of others. But he knew one thing: there he would have the necessary tools to fight more effectively, not only for himself, but for all those who, like him, needed to be heard. His first day of school was a milestone.
He entered the law room with the same sparkle in his eyes as he had when he stood before the judge.
There, he was not just looking for a degree, but a life mission.
During classes, Lucas began to absorb knowledge, each legal concept, each historical case.
But he also felt different.
He had unique experience and practical knowledge of what it meant to be treated unfairly by a flawed system. That experience gave him a perspective that no textbook could offer.
He already knew what the true face of justice was, and also the lack of it. Lucas began to make friends in college, young people who shared his vision and were interested in his story.
Many wanted to hear about his experience in court, how he was able to defend himself, and how this motivated him to pursue a career in law. But for Lucas, the real reason he was there was something else. He wanted to be the voice of the voiceless, the hope for those who couldn't fight alone. Over the years, Lucas not only excelled academically, but also became involved in social projects, providing legal assistance to needy communities.
He knew that while his college journey was an important step, his true mission lay beyond the books. His journey had begun, but he still had a lot to learn and achieve.
With each step, the dream of fighting for justice for everyone became more palpable.
Eventually, Lucas graduated with honors, and his name became respected in legal circles. He was no longer the boy who challenged a system, but the lawyer who changed realities. His work as an advocate for social causes spread, and his story inspired other generations to fight for a better future. His journey was far from over, but he knew that each step he took brought him closer to his ultimate goal, ensuring that, in the future, no one would be treated the way he had been. And with each life he touched with his advocacy, Lucas knew he was building a more just world, one case at a time.
And so, we come to the end of this video.
If you liked the story, don't forget to like and share with your friends.
Subscribe to the channel for more content like this and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos. Until next time.